Grimora.
Snow pressed against the windows of the regional hospital in slow waves, blurring the view of the parking lot and the road beyond. The storm had started in the afternoon and continued through evening without a break. By Christmas Eve night, only a few cars remained in the outer rows, covered in a quiet white layer. Inside, the building moved on in its usual low rhythm, fluorescent lights steady in the hallways, and monitors humming softly behind half-closed doors. On the fourth floor, in the older medical wing, the corridor lights were dimmed to the overnight level. Most patient rooms on that side had been closed after the newer wing opened the previous year. Doors were shut, blinds drawn, and equipment removed. Only a few rooms near the nurses' station remained in intermittent use for overflow cases. Amelia Cross sat behind the desk at that station, reviewing charts while the wall clock advanced toward midnight. She worked the holiday night shift every year by choice, living close enough to walk when the weather made driving uncertain. The unit census was low. 2 post-operative patients slept under light sedation at one end of the hall. A long-term observation case rested in a monitored room at the other. The rest of the fourth floor felt mostly empty. The call light panel above the desk displayed a small grid of indicators, each tied to a room's bedside button and door sensor. The rooms in the closed wing showed no lights. Their circuits had been disconnected months earlier, when the hospital discommissioned that side for renovation that never fully started. One indicator still carried a label from the old configuration, room 309. The physical room sat at the far end of the now quiet corridor, just around a corner, technically part of the same floor, but on the edge of the older layout. The room had not held a patient since before Amelia transferred to the hospital several years ago. There was a story attached to it, spoken mostly by staff who had worked there longer. They said that one winter, years ago, a patient in 309 had rung the call bell repeatedly during a busy storm night. Delays in staffing and power fluctuations caused by the weather had slowed response times. By the time someone reached the room, the patient had suffered a cardiac event and could not be revived. After that, equipment malfunctions and odd alarms seemed to focus around that room more than others, until administration finally took it offline. The call panel light for 309 should not have been connected now. Engineering had marked the circuit as inactive during the last inspection. On the paperwork in front of Amelia, the room did not appear on the active list. At 11:47 p.m., the corridor lay in its usual overnight stillness. A monitor beeped softly behind one of the partially closed doors. The television in the waiting area played muted news loops with automated subtitles. The heating system pushed a controlled flow of warm air through the vents, struggling slightly against drafts from the older windows. Amelia finished entering a note and checked the panel out of habit. All active rooms showed their normal status. No calls, no alarms. She stood, stretched her neck, and walked to the window near the end of the nurses' station to look out at the storm. Snow spread across the flat roof below, accumulating around the base of the mechanical units. The highway in the distance was reduced to 2 faint lines moving through gray. As the wall clock reached 11:52, a sound carried faintly from the direction of the older wing. At first, it resembled a simple relay click somewhere behind the walls, the kind of background noise that most staff learned to tune out. Then it repeated, sharper, aligned with a subtle change in the ambient hum. The call panel beeped once. A single red square lit up in the otherwise dark grid, room 309. The label beneath the light, written years ago in thin black marker, glowed in the reflected red. The indicator blinked in the same pattern as any active room call. On the small overhead speaker tied to the system, a short tone sounded to acknowledge the event. Amelia watched it without moving. The system should not have been able to generate that alert. The room was closed, the equipment removed, the wiring marked for upgrade. She checked the board again to confirm that no other room had called. Only 309 flashed, steady and insistent. She pressed the reset button on the console. the light did not go out. The call tone repeated, low and regular. The indicator continued to blink at the same interval. On the second repetition, the corridor lights at the far end dimmed slightly, then returned to normal. The air felt cooler for a moment, as if a draft had slipped along the ceiling and settled above the older wing. She picked up the small unit phone and rang the engineering extension. The call went to a recorded message indicating limited overnight coverage during the storm. She left a short note about a possible false signal on the fourth-floor panel and hung up. The light for 309 continued to flash. She stepped out from behind the desk and walked slowly down the hall. The soles of her shoes made a muted sound against the floor tiles. At each occupied room, she glanced through the door window to confirm that her patients were still resting quietly. They were. No monitors showed abnormal readings. No other call lights illuminated. The air cooled further as she approached the corner leading to the older corridor where 309 waited. The renovation signs still hung on the walls, noting restricted access and future updates. The overhead lights past that point were dimmer, set to an energy-saving mode. A faint mechanical sound rolled through the ceiling, like a distant elevator movement, though the main elevator bank sat on the other side of the floor. She paused at the corner and listened. The call chime echoed softly from the ceiling speaker near the intersection. The panel at the nurse's station repeated the alert. Each tone arrived in perfect sequence, spaced exactly the same number of seconds apart. The corridor beyond the corner stretched toward the closed door of room 309. The door itself was standard, with a narrow vertical window set into the upper panel. A small plastic slot beside the handle held an outdated name card. The lights above that section of the hall flickered once, then steadied. Amelia walked forward at an even pace, stopping a few feet from the door. She looked through the window. The room beyond sat in complete darkness. No monitor lights, no bed lamp, no running equipment. The blinds were partly open, allowing a thin gray glow from the exterior lights to enter. It was enough to outline the empty bed frame and the wall where the headboard would normally be. The call chime repeated above her. The indicator light outside the room, mounted near the ceiling, blinked with each tone. It was the classic square unit every other room had, except this one should have been disconnected. Yet the casing pulsed with a dull red glow. She placed her hand on the door handle. The metal felt much colder than the surrounding air. The chill traveled across her skin in a way that did not match the general temperature of the hallway. She tested the latch gently. It did not move. The door was locked from the outside, as per the closure protocol. Another chime sounded from the ceiling. On the wall inside, a faint light flickered near where a call cord would once have been. The power line to that fixture should have been cut, yet a momentary glow traced the outline, like current passing through a disconnected wire. Amelia watched the interior for any sign of motion. There was none. Only the small, repeated flash near the head of the bed, timed with the chime. She checked the clock above the door. The hands hovered at 11:59. The hospital's main overhead paging system clicked around the building as it reset for the hour. Somewhere downstairs at the front desk, a staff member announced the time. On the fourth floor, the voice came through as a faint, muted sound, rendered nearly unintelligible by the walls and distance. At the exact moment the clock reached midnight, the call tone changed. Instead of the simple alert note, a different sound came through the speaker above the door. It resembled a short burst of static, shaped into syllables, like words attempting to form without a clear channel. The pattern repeated, a few seconds of low, distorted sound, then silence, then the same sequence again. It carried a regular rhythm, the kind associated with someone pressing the call button repeatedly. Amelia listened with measured attention. The sound was not loud. It did not carry the sharpness of an alarm. It was subdued, almost like a voice speaking through water. But the system was not configured for two-way audio. That feature had never been installed on this wing. She said aloud that the room was unassigned and that help was present in the corridor.
Her voice sounded steady, absorbed quickly by the walls. The static tone paused for a long moment, then resumed. The overhead lights in the hallway dimmed by a single degree and took on a colder shade. The air temperature seemed to fall by several points. Her breath became faintly visible when she exhaled. Somewhere along the ceiling, a ventilation duct clicked as the metal adjusted to the change. Behind the window, the outline of the empty bed remained unchanged. A shadow on the far wall seemed to shift slightly, more from the movement of light than from any physical motion. The call indicator continued to blink. Amelia remembered the story about the patient who had once occupied this room. The older nurses had not agreed on every detail, but certain parts of the story aligned. A winter storm, short-staffed night shift, several emergency admissions arriving at once, a call from 309 going unanswered, longer than it should have, the staff finally reaching the room and finding the patient unresponsive, with the call button still pressed in one hand. After that night, they said, the room's call light had gone off by itself at random times, even when the room was empty. Technicians had checked the wiring repeatedly without finding a clear cause. The pattern seemed to recur around the same time of year. The static tone from the speaker shortened. For a few repetitions, only a single compressed burst sounded, like a syllable cut in half. Then the chime returned to its original alert pattern. The panel at the nurse's station continued to show an active call. Amelia stepped back from the door and walked slowly toward the corner. As she moved away, she listened for any change in the sound. The call tone persisted, but its pitch seemed lower, less insistent. At the nurse's station, the panel still displayed the blinking red for 309. She pressed the reset control again. This time, the light went out. The audio chime stopped instantly. The hallway temperature began to rise, almost imperceptibly at first. The faint white trace of her breath disappeared. The vent cycle resumed its normal cycle. Noise from an elevator on another floor carried through the building again. She made a note in the unit log describing a possible system error linked to room 309 at exactly midnight on December 24th, with no patients assigned to that room and no staff physically present inside it at the time. She documented the fact that the interface had required 2 reset attempts before clearing. Later, near the end of her shift, she spoke briefly with one of the longest-serving nurses in the break room. When Amelia mentioned the time and the room number, the older nurse nodded slowly and said that the same thing had happened last Christmas Eve and the one before that. Always at midnight, always the same room. Engineering had never found a physical fault that matched the timing. By the time the morning staff arrived and the storm began to ease, the 4th floor looked completely ordinary. The housekeepers moved their carts down the main hall. The day shift charge nurse reviewed assignments at the station. Doctors walked their rounds with clipboards and tablets. At the far end of the older wing, room 309 remained locked, its interior dark and empty. The call light above the door showed no activity. The small label on the panel at the nurse's station stayed unlit. When winter returned and another December night reached its last hour, snow would fall against the windows again, and the grid of call indicators above the 4th floor desk would remain mostly quiet. At 11:59, the building would settle into its usual stillness. At midnight, room 309 would call once more, its light blinking steadily for someone who could no longer press the button, repeating a pattern that the decommissioned wiring could not fully erase.